Hey guys, today we're peeling back the layers of human history, not to find some dusty old crown in a forgotten tomb, but to trace the whisper of an idea, a concept so deeply ingrained in our collective psyche that it shaped civilizations, launched wars, and basically decided who got to boss everyone around for millennia. Imagine, if you will, the vast, shimmering savanna stretching before you, the sun baking the dusty earth, the air thick with the scent of wild grasses and the distant rumble of thunder. You're not quite human yet, not in the way you understand it, but you're part of a small, chattering band of primates, and survival is a daily negotiation. One wrong move, one missed signal from the towering alpha male or the shrewd matriarch, and well, you probably won't survive this. No Netflix, no comfy bed, just the harsh realities of the prehistoric world, where the pecking order wasn't about who had the most likes on their latest cave painting, but who literally kept the lights on, or more accurately, kept the saber-toothed tigers away. So you're scampering through the undergrowth, ears swiveling, eyes scanning for danger, but also for opportunity. In these primal family units, leadership wasn't an elected position. It was often a raw display of strength, intelligence, or sometimes just sheer stubbornness. Think about your average chimp troop. You've got your alpha male strutting around like he owns the place, chest beating, displaying his might. He gets first dibs on the best food, the prime sleeping spots, and he's usually the one breaking up fights, often by simply being the biggest and loudest. This isn't exactly the divine right of kings, but it's a foundational blueprint for hierarchical thinking. You learn quickly to recognize the subtle cues of dominance and submission. A low crouch, an averted gaze, a swift offering of a tasty grub, these are your social currency. This dominance isn't just brute force, though. It's also about forging alliances, knowing who to groom, literally, and who to intimidate with a well-timed bark. It's a dynamic, ever-shifting landscape where one bad decision could see the alpha dethroned by a younger, hungrier rival, leaving you to wonder if you backed the right monkey. As we fast forward very, very slowly through the eons, our ancestors begin to stand taller, both literally and figuratively. When Homo sapiens first started venturing out of Africa, spreading across the globe, the social structures began to subtly morph. Hunter-gatherer societies, for instance, were often far more egalitarian than later, more complex civilizations. You see, when you're constantly on the move, chasing herds, gathering berries, and living hand-to-mouth, accumulating vast personal wealth or power becomes a bit tricky. Can you imagine trying to lug around your gold-plated chariot while tracking a mammoth? Not very practical. Leadership in these groups was typically fluid and situational. The best hunter might lead the hunt, the wisest elder might arbitrate disputes, and the most experienced shaman might guide spiritual ceremonies. There wasn't one single boss for everything. It was more like a highly specialized team, where everyone had a role, and leaders emerged organically based on their demonstrated skill or wisdom for a particular task. Historians still argue whether this egalitarianism was a deliberate social choice, or simply a logistical necessity for nomadic existence. Was it a proto-democracy, or just a really good way to avoid arguments about who was in charge of carrying the heaviest rocks? This relatively fluid state of affairs persisted for tens of thousands of years. But then came the big game changer, agriculture. Imagine waking up one day and realizing you don't have to chase your dinner anymore. You can plant it, cultivate it, and watch it grow right outside your mud brick hut. This wasn't just a culinary revolution, it was a societal earthquake. People started settling down. Permanent villages sprang up, then towns, then gasp, cities. And with settlement came new problems and opportunities. You had to manage irrigation systems, store surplus food, defend your precious crops from rival groups, and organize larger numbers of people for communal projects. Suddenly, that informal leadership based on who was best at finding berries just wasn't cutting it. You needed someone to coordinate the building of a granary, someone to oversee the distribution of food during a lean season, someone to lead the warriors when the folks from the next valley got a bit too curious about your juicy harvest. This new, settled way of life created the conditions for power to centralize. Instead of temporary, task-specific leaders, you started to see individuals or families whose influence became more permanent. Perhaps they were exceptionally good at mediating disputes, or they possessed unique knowledge of the seasons, or maybe they just had the biggest biceps and the loudest roar. Often, these early leaders held both secular and spiritual authority, seen as conduits to the gods or possessors of sacred knowledge. It's a bit like your local community organizer suddenly becoming the high priest, chief engineer, and supreme commander all rolled into one. One quirky tidbit. Some anthropologists suggest that early communal feasting, where leaders demonstrated their ability to provide abundance, played a significant role in cementing their authority and creating social bonds. You know, follow me, I have the biggest barbecue pit. This wasn't yet a king, in the sense of a divine monarch ruling over a vast empire, but it was the very first crack in the tribal chief model, a tiny seed of centralized power being planted in the fertile soil of settled human existence. The idea was brewing, simmering quietly in the pots of the first farmers. The idea that one person or one family could hold sway over many, not just for a hunt, but for a lifetime. These burgeoning leaders, whether by force of personality, exceptional wisdom, or even by claiming some unique connection to the spiritual realm, started to offer something new: stability. In a world fraught with uncertainty, disease, famine, raids from hostile neighbors, a strong, permanent leader could promise order, protection, and a predictable system for distributing resources. It was a trade-off, of course. You gave up some of that fluid autonomy, that informal, everybody's a boss vibe, in exchange for what seemed like a safer, more organized existence. And as these communities grew, so did the potential for one individual to consolidate enough power to truly shape the destiny of their burgeoning civilization. The stage was being set, not for a simple chief, but for something much grander, much more enduring. You blink slowly, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke filling your nostrils. It's not the chill, untamed wind of the hunter-gatherer existence anymore. No, this air is thick with the promise of something stable, something fixed. You feel the unfamiliar ache in your lower back from hours spent bending over, planting tiny, vulnerable seeds in the dark, loamy soil. Your hands, once nimble with a spear, are now calloused from the rough handles of a digging stick. And honestly, this whole settled life thing, it's going to be exhausting. You probably won't survive this. Not because of a saber-toothed tiger, mind you, but from sheer bureaucratic overload. Imagine trying to explain crop rotation to someone who thinks dinner means chasing something furry for 3 days. Because here's the thing about planting a field. It ties you down. You can't just pack up your woven basket and wander off when the berries run out or the bison migrate. No, your entire future, your very existence, is literally rooted in this patch of ground. And when your patch of ground is right next to their patch of ground, and everyone's got a hungry stomach, well, things get complicated. Suddenly, that casual group consensus you had when you were just chasing mammoths together isn't quite cutting it. Who decides when to plant? Who gets the water from the river? Who tells Kevin from the next family over that he can't just wander onto your plot and snack on your ripening barley? That's right. Someone needs to be in charge. This quiet, revolutionary shift, the one we so dryly call the Neolithic Revolution, was less about flashy conquests and more about the tedious, repetitive work of making a living from the earth. You had to plan, you had to store, you had to protect, and you had to make sure everyone pulled their weight. It wasn't just about sharing a kill anymore. It was about managing a collective effort that spanned seasons, years, even generations. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, individuals started to rise. Not necessarily the strongest spear thrower or the wisest elder who remembered where the best wild nuts grew. No, now it was often the one who could organize, the one who could mediate, the one who could convince everyone that building a shared granary was a good idea, even if it meant less time gossiping by the river. Consider the early settlements like Saddle-Huruk in modern-day Turkey, flourishing around 7500 BCE. Here, you find thousands of people living in dense, interconnected mud brick houses, often entered from the roof. Think about that for a second. No streets, just a continuous honeycomb of dwellings. How do you coordinate anything in a place like that? Who settles disputes when your neighbor's roof is also your patio? These were highly complex societies, much larger than any hunter-gatherer band, and they absolutely demanded a higher degree of social organization. While we don't find definitive palaces or thrones in Saddle-Huruk, the very scale and longevity of the settlement scream someone was in charge, or at least, someone was very good at delegating. You didn't just wake up one morning and decide, hey, let's build a city out of connected boxes. Without some form of leadership overseeing the grand design, the resource allocation, and the occasional argument about which family's cooking smoke was bothering whose rooftop nap. So how did these first chiefs, or headmen, come to power? Was it through sheer charisma, through cunning, or perhaps simply by being the best at predicting the weather for planting? Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of permanent leadership in these agricultural communities arose from a voluntary delegation of authority for the common good, or if it was a more coercive process, where individuals leveraged their control over resources, perhaps a particularly fertile piece of land, or a knack for storing surplus grain to accumulate power. Did people choose their first manager, or did the manager simply emerge from the sheer necessity of the situation, becoming indispensable, and then, well, a little too comfortable with that indispensable feeling? It's the difference between a helpful volunteer coordinator and a benevolent dictator who just happens to control all the good seeds. And here's a little tidbit that might make you chuckle. Some archaeologists speculate that one of the earliest signs of more complex societal organization might be found not in grand buildings, but in mundane things like standardized pottery or specific tools. If everyone in a large village is suddenly using the exact same type of clay pot, made with the same technique, it suggests a shared production method, perhaps even some centralized oversight or distribution. It's like discovering that every single early human settlement had a mandatory Tuesday is Taco Tuesday rule, complete with identical regulation-sized tortillas. Somebody had to sign off on that, or maybe it was just a particularly influential pottery influencer. You simply must try my new ergonomic gourd-shaped bowl. It's all the rage. The responsibilities of these early leaders expanded beyond just land and food. They became the arbiters of justice when someone's goat inevitably wandered into another's field. They organized defensive measures against raiding parties. Because if you've spent an entire year growing delicious wheat, you bet someone else is going to want to take it. It was a stressful job, no doubt. Imagine trying to get a consensus from 50 families about the best place to dig a well, while simultaneously explaining that no, the giant, fuzzy, woolly rhino you saw last week is not a good candidate for a pet. It's for the children, you say? Really, Reginald? It's going to eat the children. You can almost hear the rhythmic thud of the grinding stones as the harvested grain is turned into flour, the murmur of voices as families gather at the communal fire, the distant bleating of sheep now herded and managed, no longer wild game. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic poof, here's a king moment. It was a slow, agonizingly incremental shift, driven by the very practical demands of feeding more mouths from less space. It was the original scaling challenge. When your company grows from 5 people to 500, you don't just keep managing it with a quick chat over coffee. You need structures, rules, and yes, someone to enforce them. The transition from a nomadic existence, where problems were often solved by simply moving on, to a settled one, where problems had to be solved right there, on the spot, was profound. It necessitated a new kind of social contract. You gave up some individual autonomy for collective security and prosperity. And the person who embodied that contract, who stood at the center of that web of interdependence, was the nascent form of what would eventually, many millennia down the line, be called a king. They weren't wearing crowns yet, or sitting on jeweled thrones. They were probably just the person who remembered where everyone's digging sticks were, and had the loudest voice when it came to rallying the troops to fix the leaky irrigation ditch. But the seed, pun intended, was sown. The idea that someone, one person, could hold a unique position of authority over an entire community, a position beyond mere persuasion or temporary influence, was beginning to take root in the fertile soil of the Neolithic age. The next phase of your journey will delve into how these early leaders solidified their power, turning a necessary role into an inherited right, and ultimately, a divine mandate. You find yourself now, if you can imagine it, standing on the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, like ancient veins, pump life into a landscape that stretches flat and wide. The air shimmers with heat, carrying the scent of rich, damp earth mingled with something less pleasant, probably the lingering aroma of thousands of years of human activity, mixed with a bit of canal water, and perhaps, if you're unlucky, a waft from an uncleaned animal pen. Around you, rising from the Fertile Crescent, are not just scattered villages anymore, but proper cities. You hear the ceaseless chatter of a marketplace, the rhythmic thud of a weaver's loom, the distant, echoing chants from a massive ziggurat piercing the cerulean sky. This isn't just a bigger village. This is a complex organism of interconnected lives, all buzzing with purpose, and perhaps a healthy dose of anxiety. If you'd lived here back then, say in the bustling streets of Uruk or navigating the political landscape between these burgeoning urban centers, well, let's just say your life expectancy wasn't exactly setting any world records. Survival was less about mastering the art of the perfect selfie, and more about not getting speared during a border dispute over water rights, or falling afoul of whatever divine wrath your city's patron deity decided to unleash. It was a time when the stakes were extraordinarily high, where the collective success of your entire community hinged on something, or someone, guiding the ship through frequently choppy waters. And this, my friend, is where the idea of a king truly starts to coalesce. not just as a temporary leader for a hunting party or a respected elder in a small farming collective, but as a permanent, central figurehead of a vast, interdependent society. Remember how we talked about the Neolithic Revolution, how settling down and farming created a need for more organized leadership. Well, the Sumerians took that concept and ran with it, straight into the urban jungle. They built cities like Uruk, which by 2900 BCE was perhaps the largest city in the world, home to tens of thousands of people, boasting monumental architecture that would make modern skyscrapers blush. Imagine the logistical nightmare of feeding, watering, and defending that many people. You couldn't just rely on good vibes and shared snacks anymore. Someone had to coordinate the massive irrigation projects that kept the fields watered, organize the labor for erecting those colossal temples, manage the distribution of surplus grain, and, crucially, lead the defense against other ambitious city-states who might eye your resources with envy. This wasn't a popularity contest. This was a job for someone with real, tangible authority. Initially, these leaders might have been what we call priest-kings or ensi, focusing heavily on religious duties and maintaining the favor of the gods, because, let's be honest, in a world where droughts and floods could wipe out your entire harvest, keeping the divine powers happy was priority number one. They were the intermediaries between the human and the divine, responsible for elaborate rituals and offerings to ensure the prosperity of the city. You can almost hear the whispered prayers echoing through the temple courtyards, punctuated by the rustle of priestly robes. But as these city-states grew, and as conflicts over land and trade routes became more frequent, the need for a different kind of leader emerged. The Lugal, or big man, often associated more directly with military prowess. Think of it this way: your city needs a massive wall built yesterday. You can't wait for a consensus from 1,000 different families. You need someone to say, right, everyone grab a shovel, we start digging at dawn, and anyone caught napping gets to personally test the structural integrity of the first few layers. That's where the Lugal stepped in. Their authority was more secular, more geared towards practical governance, law, and warfare. Interestingly, historians still argue whether the Lugal evolved directly from the Ensi with an increased focus on military matters, or if they were distinct roles that eventually merged or competed for supremacy within the city-state. It's like trying to figure out if your favorite band's sound evolved, or if they just hired a new, louder drummer. These early kings weren't just figureheads, they were active administrators. They issued laws, settled disputes, often with surprising severity. Considering some of the ancient law codes we found, oversaw public works, and managed the incredibly complex bureaucracy required to keep a city running. Imagine the amount of clay tablets needed just to keep track of grain surpluses, labor assignments, and taxes. Their early attempts at record-keeping were so thorough. Sometimes you wonder if they secretly invented the concept of paperwork, just to make future historians groan. It was probably less thrilling than it sounds, involving a lot of scratching with a reed stylus onto damp clay. And you thought your taxes were complicated. One of the more fascinating, and frankly, rather convenient, aspects of these early kingships was the development of the idea of divine legitimacy. Many Sumerian kings, like the legendary Gilgamesh, who was, by all accounts, a bit of a handful even for a king, were said to have been divinely appointed or even to possess some godly ancestry. This wasn't just a clever marketing ploy, though it certainly helped with public relations. It deeply ingrained the king's authority within the religious framework of society. If the gods themselves chose you, Who were mere mortals to argue? It's the ultimate mic drop in any debate over leadership. Because the god said so, that's why. It probably saved a lot of otherwise lengthy, tedious discussions in the royal council. And while they were building empires and asserting divine right, they also had a rather endearing side. For instance, the Sumerians were big on beer. It wasn't just a beverage. It was a staple of their diet, safer to drink than water, and even used as a form of payment. Some quirky tidbits suggest that specific beer recipes were even inscribed on tablets for royal consumption, implying that kings might have had their own special brews. So, while you were sweating over irrigation canals, your king might have been enjoying a frothy, albeit grain-heavy, pint. It puts a slightly more relatable spin on divine rule, doesn't it? Maybe a king's best policy decision came after a particularly good batch of ale. So, from the humble beginnings of settled communities, through the complex challenges of urban life, the idea of a king, a singular, powerful leader, emerged. They were the organizers, the protectors, the spiritual intermediaries, and sometimes the biggest beer drinkers in the land. They brought order to chaos, structure to society, and laid the very first bricks, both literally and figuratively, for every kingdom and empire that would follow. The throne, initially perhaps just a slightly elevated seat in a council chamber, was beginning to acquire the weight of destiny, the glimmer of gold, and the very real power to shape the lives of hundreds of thousands. You can almost feel the weight of that responsibility, don't you? The clamor of the city, the demands of the gods, the constant threat of rival cities. It's a lot to manage, even for someone divinely chosen. Priest-king authority, spiritual and temporal power began to merge in ancient cultures. You stand on the sun-baked, cracked earth, the smell of dust and something vaguely sacrificial hanging heavy in the air. The crowd around you murmurs, a low hum of anticipation and perhaps a touch of fear. Your eyes, if you dare to lift them, are drawn to the raised dais, where, bathed in the blinding Mesopotamian sun, stands a figure draped in elaborate, multi-layered robes. These aren't just any robes. They're woven with threads of deep indigo and shimmering gold, perhaps even adorned with tiny, iridescent beetle wings, catching the light as he shifts his weight. The air itself seems to thicken, humming with the weight of expectation. You can almost feel the collective breath held, the slight tremor in the ground from thousands of bare feet. He wears a tall, conical headdress, not unlike a very fancy dunce cap, but this one is intricately beaded, possibly with lapis lazuli, a stone so blue it looks like a piece of the night sky fell to earth. In one hand he holds a staff, carved with symbols you don't quite understand but instinctively recognize as powerful. A coiled serpent, a stylized eagle, something that looks a bit like a squiggly river. In the other, a small, polished stone, smooth from countless touches, perhaps a relic of an ancient pact with the heavens. His gaze, if it ever meets yours, feels less like a human's and more like a force of nature, an ancient river carving its way through stone. You realize with a slight internal shiver that this person doesn't just lead you. He is the conduit to the very gods. He is the sky, the earth, the harvest. He is the reason your crops might fail or flourish, the reason your family might feast or starve. And just for a moment, you consider what a bad day for him might mean for you. It's a sobering thought because, let's be honest, in this era, if the priest king has a bad Tuesday, you probably won't survive the week. This merging of roles, this embodiment of both divine favor and earthly command, wasn't some sudden invention. Instead, It was a gradual, almost inevitable evolution born from the complexities of settled life. Remember those early tribal chiefs, the ones good at hunting or storytelling? Well, once you get thousands of people living cheek by jowl in a city, relying on intricate irrigation systems and coordinated labor, good at hunting just doesn't cut it anymore. You need someone who can convince people that digging a massive canal in the scorching heat is a really good idea, not just because the fields need water, but because the god of agriculture demands it. The Sumerians, bless their innovative hearts, were among the first to truly perfect this hybrid model. Their rulers, like the famed Gudea of Lagash, weren't just administrators or military strategists. They were first and foremost high priests. Their job descriptions essentially read, manages state affairs, consults with deities on optimal planting times, ensures good harvests, occasionally smites enemies, all while looking fabulous in an elaborate beard. This blending wasn't just ceremonial. It was profoundly practical. If the gods sanctioned the ruler, then defying the ruler was defying the gods. It's like getting a divine cease and desist letter, only with more potential for locusts. This dual authority provided an incredibly robust framework for maintaining order and mobilizing large populations for monumental tasks. Whether it was building ziggurats, those massive, step pyramid temples that looked like cosmic wedding cakes, or organizing vast agricultural projects. One mainstream historical fact you might find rather compelling is that in early Mesopotamian city-states, the temple was often the largest and most influential economic institution, functioning as a massive storehouse, a redistribution center, and even a bank. The priest-king, therefore, controlled the literal breadbasket of the community, cementing his power. Now, for a quirkier tidbit, some ancient Egyptian pharaohs, who also embraced this priest-king concept with gusto, reportedly had a ritual where they would symbolically run the circuit of their kingdom during certain festivals, even in old age. The idea was to demonstrate their continued vigor and ability to rule, proving they were still divinely blessed. Imagine a monarch, well past his prime, huffing and puffing around a track, just to prove he's still got it. It's the ancient equivalent of your grandpa showing off his push-ups at Thanksgiving, only with slightly higher stakes like, the stability of an entire civilization. You can almost hear the crowd. Go, Pharaoh, go. Don't trip over your scepter. Historians still argue whether the idea of a king emerged primarily from the need for a strong military leader to defend against rivals, or if it was more fundamentally rooted in the religious leader's role in ensuring divine favor and agricultural prosperity. Was it the warrior who became sacred, or the holy man who took up the sword? It's a bit of a chicken and egg question, really, with far fewer actual chickens and significantly more ancient Mesopotamian bureaucracy. But what's clear is that the fusion of these two pillars, the earthly and the divine, created a powerful, enduring archetype. The priest-king was the ultimate multitasker, managing earthly logistics while simultaneously appeasing the heavens, juggling prayer beads with grain inventories, and ensuring that you, the humble citizen, knew exactly who was in charge, both here and in the great beyond. You feel the coarse sand gritty between your toes, the relentless Egyptian sun beating down on your neck like a vengeful deity. The air shimmers over the vast, flat landscape, broken only by the distant, colossal silhouette of a partially built pyramid, its ramps crawling with ant-like figures. You hear the rhythmic grunt of thousands of laborers, the sharp crack of whips, and the low, guttural chanting of priests. This isn't just a big construction project. This is a monument to a living god, You glance nervously at the overseer, sweat stinging your eyes. In this world, you are a speck, utterly beholden to the man, no, the being who stands at the apex of everything. Remember how some cultures started blending spiritual and temporal power, with priest-kings holding sway. Well, here in the scorching cradle of ancient Egypt, they cranked that dial up to 11. You aren't just dealing with a king who claims divine favor. You're dealing with a king who is divine. Your ruler, the pharaoh, walks among you, breathes the same dusty air, yet he is believed to be the embodiment of a god. Specifically, the falcon-headed god Horus, right here on earth. And when he shuffles off this mortal coil, he doesn't just die. He ascends, transforming into Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Pretty neat trick if you can manage it. This isn't some mere symbolic gesture, a fancy title to slap on a business card. This is the bedrock of their entire civilization. The pharaoh isn't just signing decrees, he's maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order. Think of it like this. If the Nile doesn't flood, if the crops fail, if chaos reigns, it's not because of bad policy or a rogue weather system. Oh no, it's because the pharaoh, in his infinite wisdom or lack thereof, if things are going poorly for you, isn't performing his divine duties correctly. So when a god tells you to build a giant triangle in the middle of nowhere, you don't ask, why? You just ask, how many more millions of bricks? Because your very existence, your daily bread, the rising of the sun, it all hinges on this one person. And you're hauling a colossal stone block, the weight tearing at your shoulders, and you think, if I drop this, I'm probably not surviving the day, let alone my afterlife. Talk about high stakes. The pharaoh's life is a meticulously choreographed dance of ritual and symbolism. Every movement, every utterance, every blink of an eye is imbued with spiritual significance. You might see a procession of priests meticulously anointing him with rare oils, or carefully positioning his double crown. The tall white crown of Upper Egypt merged with the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing his absolute dominion over both lands. He lives in a palace that's less a home and more a sacred precinct, bustling with scribes, priests, and an army of servants dedicated to upholding his divine status. It's said that some pharaohs had official, sandal bearers, whose entire job was to carry their sacred footwear. Imagine getting that job description at an HR meeting. So you'll be responsible for the divine Crocs, essentially. Polish them daily, no scuffs, and for the love of Ra, don't lose one. You can almost hear the performance review. Excellent sandal bearing, but your spiritual aura is a bit dusty. This system, though seemingly absolute, wasn't without its quirks. While the pharaoh was a god, he was also a human, prone to the occasional bad decision, or even just a bad mood. Historians still argue whether the common Egyptian truly believed the pharaoh was a literal flesh-and-blood god, or if it was more of a sophisticated political and religious metaphor, a necessary fiction to maintain order in a vast, complex society. Was it genuine devotion, or simply a very effective way to keep the peace and ensure massive public works projects like the pyramids got built? We may never know for sure what went on inside the heads of those ancient laborers squinting at the sun. The sheer scale of the power is breathtaking. The pharaoh owned all the land, commanded all the resources, and controlled the entire religious apparatus. His decrees were the word of God, his justice divine, and his very presence imbued with Heka, a magical energy. You can almost feel the weight of that responsibility, even if you're just a spectator. Every harvest, every flood of the Nile, every victory in battle was attributed directly to his divine intervention. Even the bureaucracy, immense as it was, revolved around him. Even living gods need accountants, after all. You think all that gold just counts itself? No, there were legions of scribes, tallying everything from grain harvests to temple offerings, all ultimately flowing to or from the divine pharaoh. This unique model of divine kingship, where the ruler was a direct link to the cosmos, profoundly shaped Egyptian culture for thousands of years. It dictated their art, their architecture, their funerary practices, and their very understanding of life and death. You see it everywhere, from the colossal statues of Ramesses II staring imperiously across the desert, to the intricate hieroglyphs inside the tombs, all reinforcing the pharaoh's unique status. It was a complete integration of religion and state, taken to its logical and utterly grand extreme. You might not survive a week in the scorching heat without modern amenities, but the pharaohs ensured their legacy would last for millennia, purely by convincing everyone they were, well, gods. You're standing on sun-baked bricks, ancient and worn, feeling the phantom heat radiate from centuries of forgotten noons. A gentle breeze whispers across what was once a bustling street, carrying the scent of dust. And if your imagination is really working overtime, maybe a hint of ancient wheat flour and unidentifiable urban funk. Around you, the ruins of a city stretch out, not grand palaces reaching for the heavens, like those you might recall from Egypt, nor the colossal ziggurats of Sumer, but rather a sprawling, meticulously planned grid of houses, public baths, and an almost unnervingly uniform infrastructure. This is Mohenjo-Daro, or perhaps Harappa, one of the twin jewels of the Indus Valley civilization, a place that feels strangely normal. Or as normal as a civilization that vanished without a trace can feel. You trace the outline of what was likely a drainage system, complex and sophisticated, far more advanced than anything you'd expect from its contemporaries. You notice the precise angles of the corners, the standardization of the bricks, all fired to an identical ratio. Mind you, for thousands of square miles across a territory larger than modern-day Western Europe. It's the kind of obsessive neatness that would make a modern city planner weep with joy, or perhaps just curl into a fetal position from sheer envy. The sheer scale and consistency suggest an incredible degree of organization, a collective effort that whispers of careful oversight. But who was doing the overseeing? That's the multi-million-dollar, or rather, the multi-millennium-old question. You scan the horizon, looking for the telltale signs you've learned to associate with powerful rulers. Where are the massive tombs filled with gold and sacrificed servants? The colossal statues depicting a god-king with an impossibly chiseled jawline. The grand temples dedicated to a singular, all-powerful deity, clearly commissioned by a ruler eager to prove their divine right. You squint, you crane your neck, you even hop on one leg for a better vantage point, but alas, nothing. You find no evidence of monumental structures dedicated to individual glorification, no royal palaces that would make Versailles blush, no obvious throne rooms. It's almost as if the people here were allergic to showing off, which, let's be honest, is a bit refreshing after the pharaohs, who seem to have a go big or go home, preferably in a giant pyramid philosophy. Instead, you see structures like the Great Bath in Mohenjo-Daro, a vast, waterproofed brick tank, clearly designed for public ritual bathing. It's impressive, sure, but it speaks more of communal spiritual practices than the dictates of a single, all-powerful leader. Then there are the large granaries, suggesting a centralized collection and redistribution of food, which points to some form of authority, yes, but not necessarily a king with a crown and a very expensive scepter. It's like trying to figure out who runs a giant co-op apartment building. Is it the board president, the really organized tenant, or just a very effective shared Google Calendar? It's hard to tell from the ruins. This is where the Indus Valley starts to feel truly mysterious, almost unsettlingly so. While Sumer had its En and Lugal, its priest-kings who combined spiritual and temporal power, and Egypt had its pharaohs who were literally living gods, the Indus Valley gives us silence, or more accurately, an archaeological shrug. You stumble upon a small, intricately carved steatite seal. It's covered in symbols that look a bit like hieroglyphs, but they remain stubbornly undeciphered. Perhaps they tell the story of their kings, their glorious reigns, their epic battles. Or perhaps they just say, "Property of Bob. If found, please return for a really good mango." We simply don't know. The script, you see, refuses to yield its secrets, making it even harder to understand their social hierarchy. This lack of obvious royal iconography leads to one of the biggest scholarly debates surrounding this enigmatic civilization. Historians still argue whether the Indus Valley civilization was ruled by kings, priests, merchants, or perhaps even a collective of elders or a series of councils. Some suggest a priest-king figure like the famous priest-king bust from Mohenjo-Daro, a small, bearded sculpture with a patterned robe and a contemplative gaze. But is he a king? A priest? Just a particularly well-dressed dude who got his portrait done? There's no crown, no scepter, no inscription yelling, "I am the king." It's just a guy looking rather serene, as if he's just remembered he left the stove on back in 2500 BCE. So if you were an ambitious commoner in the Indus Valley, hoping to seize power, you wouldn't even know who to overthrow. Imagine the frustration. Other theories propose that the cities were governed by a form of oligarchy, a group of powerful merchants or religious leaders. The emphasis on trade, the standardized weights and measures found throughout the region, and the apparent lack of overt military installations. Though you probably won't survive this if a raiding party comes along, all lean into the idea that prosperity and communal order were maintained through economic and spiritual consensus, rather than brute force or dynastic rule. There are no obvious signs of warfare or conquest dominating the archaeological record. No massive defensive walls around every city. Unlike so many other ancient societies, where every second ruler seemed obsessed with building bigger, spikier barriers. So, while you've seen the elaborate courts of Ur and the divine majesty of Thebes, here, in the heart of the Indus, you find a society that seems to have bypassed the need for a singular, identifiable king, as we understand it. It forces you to consider a different kind of leadership, one perhaps based on practicality, urban planning, and shared ritual, rather than individual glory. They were clearly brilliant engineers and meticulous planners, but their rulers, whoever they were, appear to have been the original behind-the-scenes types. They built the world's first known urban sanitation systems, but didn't bother with giant ego-boosting statues. Truly baffling. The Indus Valley is a riddle wrapped in an enigma with a healthy dose of standardized bricks. You drift now, not through dusty Mesopotamian plains or the sun-drenched banks of the Nile, but eastward, far, far eastward, to a land where the very air hums with the whispers of dragons and ancestors. You feel the dampness of morning dew clinging to your silken slippers as you walk through a courtyard, lanterns still flickering faintly, the scent of jasmine and cypress heavy on the breeze. Overhead the sky stretches, an impossibly vast canvas of deep indigo beginning to lighten with the first blush of dawn. And in that immense sky, a concept takes shape, one that will define leadership for millennia. The mandate of heaven. It's not just a belief system. It's the very fabric of existence here. You see, while those Sumerian priest kings might have claimed a chat line to their deities, and the pharaohs literally were gods in their own minds and yours, if you wanted to keep your head attached, the Chinese took a slightly conditional approach. Imagine having a job where your divine boss gave you the keys to the kingdom, but also sent you a quarterly performance review, and if you messed up, they'd just revoke your access. Permanently, and likely painfully. This is where the cheeky reality check kicks in. If you were a ruler under the mandate of heaven, and you started seeing famines, floods, or peasant revolts, your career prospects would be looking less emperor and more ex-emperor, possibly with a rather short neck. You probably wouldn't survive this kind of performance review, actually. It was a rather direct form of divine feedback, delivered via natural disaster or mass uprising. No sugarcoating, no HR, just the heavens saying, "Nope, not feeling it anymore." The core idea, a mainstream historical fact you absolutely need to tuck into your brain before you nod off, is that the ruler, known as the Son of Heaven, was granted the right to rule by a divine cosmic power, heaven. But this right wasn't absolute. It was contingent upon his virtuous and effective governance. If the emperor became tyrannical, neglectful, or simply ineffective in maintaining peace and prosperity, heaven would withdraw its mandate, signaling this withdrawal through widespread calamities, famine, or successful rebellions. This wasn't some abstract concept. It was the ultimate justification for dynastic change. When a new dynasty emerged, they would invariably claim they had seized power because the previous one had lost the mandate. It's like having the ultimate "you're fired" clause written into your job description, but the boss is the entire universe. And let me tell you, the universe has very high standards for its management team. You might be thinking, well, that sounds like a handy excuse for anyone who just successfully overthrew the guy in charge. And you wouldn't be wrong. It did provide a convenient, universally accepted framework for legitimizing new regimes. But it also, surprisingly, placed a significant moral burden on the ruler. You couldn't just lounge around on your dragon throne all day, counting your jade and demanding more elaborate hairstyles. You had responsibilities. Big ones. The welfare of the entire realm rested on your shoulders, and if you failed, it wasn't just your reputation on the line. It was your divine right. A quirky tidbit that brings this to life is how seriously they took omens. While we might groan at a leaky faucet, an ancient Chinese emperor might interpret a prolonged drought or a comet sighting as a direct warning from heaven. Officials would pore over these events, debating their meaning, often frantically trying to advise the emperor on how to regain heaven's favor. Sometimes this would involve grand rituals and sacrifices. Other times, it meant implementing policies to alleviate suffering. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, of an emperor who, after a series of particularly nasty floods, reportedly spent 3 days dressed in sackcloth, publicly confessing his personal failings to heaven. Imagine a modern politician doing that. Yes, I admit, the pothole problem is entirely due to my recent obsession with competitive bird watching. Forgive me, constituents. This concept, the mandate of heaven, provided both stability and an inherent mechanism for revolution. It was revolutionary for its time, because it implied that the common people, or at least their suffering, could be a sign of divine disapproval. It wasn't just about bloodline or military might. It was about cosmic justification. Historians still argue whether the mandate of heaven was primarily a tool for legitimizing new dynasties, or a genuine philosophical belief system that deeply influenced governance and the moral expectations placed upon rulers? Was it a clever bit of political theater or a profound spiritual truth? You can almost feel the weight of it, the constant scrutiny of the unseen forces, as you imagine yourself as an emperor, striving for harmony, ensuring the rivers don't overflow, the crops flourish, and the people are content. It's a far cry from simply being born into power or conquering it with a big stick, isn't it? It adds a layer of cosmic accountability that makes even the most fearsome ruler pause. Because while you might control your earthly subjects, heaven, apparently, had the ultimate veto power. And heaven, unlike your human subjects, was notoriously difficult to bribe. You feel the warm Aegean breeze, thick with the scent of olives and sun-baked stone, as you stand on the grand paved court of Knossos. The air hums with a distant murmur, perhaps the bleating of sheep, or the gentle lapping of waves against a distant shore. You can almost hear the soft rustle of linen robes worn by those who once walked these very same flagstones, thousands of years before you. Imagine yourself here, amidst the vibrant frescoes depicting graceful dolphins and formidable bulls, feeling the cool plaster beneath your fingertips. It's a sensory feast, a time warp that would, without a really good healthcare plan, mean you probably wouldn't survive this. This is the heart of Minoan civilization, a Bronze Age marvel that flourished on the island of Crete, a society so advanced in some ways, yet so enigmatic in others that it still keeps historians scratching their heads. Their palaces, like this one at Knossos, were not just royal residences but sprawling administrative and economic hubs, bustling with workshops, storerooms, and elaborate living quarters. What's truly striking, when you consider the fortified cities we've talked about, is the near-total absence of defensive walls around these grand Minoan centers. It's a mainstream historical fact that points to either a profound sense of security, perhaps due to naval dominance, or a peaceful nature rarely seen in Bronze Age power dynamics. You'd think if you had a palace full of gold and fancy pottery, you'd want to put a big all-wall around it, wouldn't you? Apparently not. They were too busy enjoying their remarkably sophisticated plumbing systems, which, let's be honest, put many later civilizations to shame. No wonder they didn't need walls. They were too clean to bother. So, who was in charge here? The general consensus points towards a form of priest kingship, leaders whose authority was deeply intertwined with spiritual power. You see evidence of this in the elaborate religious rituals depicted in their art, the emphasis on goddesses, and the sacred nature of the bull. It wasn't about a conquering general or a warrior chief, at least not in the same way we might conceive of them. It felt more like a society guided by divine sanction, where the ruler was a mediator between the human and the sacred. Think less King Arthur with a sword, and more high priest channeling cosmic energy. Historians still argue whether Minoan society was genuinely matriarchal or merely matrilocal, or if these priest kings were more like chief bureaucrats managing a complex economy rather than absolute monarchs. Was it a theocracy run by pious administrators, or something even more unique? One of the most captivating and quirky tidbits from Minoan Crete, and something you've probably seen reproduced endlessly, are the frescoes depicting people leaping over the backs of charging bulls. Was it a dangerous sport, a ritualistic performance, or some combination of both? Imagine signing up for that job description. So, your main responsibility will be becoming one with the bull briefly. Don't worry, most of the time it works out. Probably. A bold career choice indeed. This era of Minoan splendor, however, wasn't destined to last forever. Around 1450 BCE, something shifted. Whether it was natural disaster, internal strife, or an invasion from the mainland, the great Minoan palaces suffered catastrophic destruction. Into this power vacuum stepped a new force, one that would redefine kingship in the Aegean: the Mycenaeans. You can almost feel the ground tremble as you transition from the open, unfortified elegance of Minoan Crete to the stark, imposing citadels of Mycenaean Greece. Here, you're not strolling through pleasant courtyards. You're standing beneath cyclopean walls, massive, roughly hewn stones fitted together with such precision that ancient Greeks believed only giants, the Cyclopes, could have moved them. These were not mere palaces. These were fortresses designed for defense, for war. Forget your plumbing, we've got walls that could stop a small army. The shift in architecture alone tells you a great deal about the shift in power. If Minoans were about gentle persuasion and divine connection, Mycenaeans were about brute force and military might. Their leaders were warlords, powerful figures known as monarchs. This title deciphered from the Linear B script, a mainstream historical fact, and one of the great archaeological breakthroughs gives us a fascinating glimpse into their administrative structure. Linear B, a syllabic script adapted from the Minoan Linear A, primarily records inventories, economic transactions, and bureaucratic lists. It reveals a highly centralized, bureaucratic system where the monarchs sat at the top, presiding over a hierarchy of officials managing everything from chariot production to olive oil distribution. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about organizing resources for war, for trade, for the maintenance of a powerful elite. This was a king, yes, but also a CEO of a very well-oiled, bronze-plated machine. And speaking of gold, the Mycenaeans were rather fond of it. You've almost certainly seen images of the famous gold death masks, particularly the so-called Mask of Agamemnon. A quirky tidbit that, while not actually belonging to the legendary king, speaks volumes about the wealth and funerary practices of these rulers. It's a haunting, magnificent piece of artistry, suggesting a belief in an afterlife befitting their earthly stature. The monarch was a king who commanded armies, accumulated vast wealth, and whose very burial was a testament to his power. Historians still debate whether the monarchs held absolute power, like the pharaohs we discussed earlier, or if he was more of a first among equals. A chief warlord whose authority relied on the support of other powerful aristocratic families. Was he a supreme autocrat? Or did he have to constantly negotiate and maintain alliances within his elite? Regardless, the Mycenaean monarchs represented a significant evolution in the idea of kingship. He wasn't just a spiritual guide or a bureaucratic manager. He was a military commander, a central figure in a fortified state, a king who ruled from behind formidable walls, wielding both economic and martial power. This was a form of kingship that was more recognizable to later European models, a prototype for the warrior kings of epic poetry. From the mysterious, unfortified palaces of the Minoans to the formidable citadels of the Mycenaeans, the concept of a king in the Aegean had clearly shifted, morphing from spiritual authority to military might, setting the stage for even more complex forms of leadership. You feel the warm desert wind caress your cheek, carrying with it the faint scent of frankincense and the distant bleating of sheep. You're standing on the cusp of an epic shift, right there in ancient Israel, as the very concept of leadership twists and turns like a river seeking a new course. For generations, your people, the scattered tribes of Israel, have been guided not by kings, but by charismatic figures called judges. These weren't your robed, bewigged arbiters of justice in a courthouse. Oh no. Think more along the lines of your local superhero, showing up only when things got truly dire. A charismatic warrior, a prophetess with a sharp mind, a strong man with a questionable haircut. They'd rise up, deliver the people from some pressing external threat, and then they'd just go back to their farms. It was a rather ad hoc system, prone to bouts of disunity, and let's be honest, a fair bit of chaos. You'd probably not survive long if you had to rely on a judge who only showed up when the Philistines were already at your doorstep, wouldn't you? Imagine trying to run a country like that today. Sorry, the CEO's off tending his vineyard. We'll get back to your annual report after he saves us from the marketing department. But now, you feel a restless murmur spreading through the dusty encampments. You hear the whispers, the grumbling. Look at all the other nations, they sigh, pointing vaguely towards the established kingdoms of your neighbors, the Bronze Age Aegean royals we mentioned, or the pharaohs whose grand tombs still impress you. They have kings, strong leaders who can muster armies, build cities, provide stability. It's a very human desire, isn't it? To see what others have and think, I want one of those. Even if, deep down, you know it might not be the best thing for you. It's like wanting that fancy sports car when your reliable old sedan gets you everywhere just fine, albeit with less flash. You approach the venerable prophet Samuel, burdened with the people's insistent clamor. He, much like an exasperated parent, tries to warn them. He paints a rather bleak picture of what a king would mean for them. He'd take their sons for charioteers and soldiers, their daughters for perfumers and cooks, their fields and vineyards for his own, and a tenth of their flocks. Essentially, he warns them, this new king will tax them, conscript them, and generally become a bit of a royal pain in their collective behind. You hear his words, and you think, wow, he's basically predicting the invention of the income tax and compulsory military service in one go. But the people, stubborn as a mule in a mud pit, just shake their heads. No, they cry, we want a king over us that we also may be like all the nations. It's a classic case of grass is greener syndrome, played out on a national scale. So the divine will, communicated through Samuel, finally relents. And here's where things get interesting. You see a tall, somewhat unassuming young man named Saul, son of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin. The mainstream historical fact here is that Saul becomes the very first king of the united monarchy of Israel, chosen not by popular vote or inherited right, but through a divine anointing. You watch as Samuel pours oil over his head, a symbolic act that sets him apart, marking him as God's chosen leader. Imagine the pressure, stepping into shoes that literally no one in your society has ever worn before. It's like being the first person to try out a new job title, Chief Royal Tax Collector. Benefits include, well, we haven't figured that out yet. Saul, by all accounts, stands head and shoulders above everyone else, quite literally. This quirky tidbit about his physical stature, being a head taller than any other person, makes you wonder about the practicalities of ancient uniform sizing. Was he constantly tripping over standard-issue tunics? Did he have to duck through every doorway? It certainly made him stand out in a crowd, which, for a king, is probably a good thing, unless you're trying to sneak out for a quiet evening. His reign, you observe, isn't without its struggles. He grapples with the transition from a decentralized, tribal society to a more unified, monarchical structure. He builds a rudimentary standing army, a vital step in centralizing power, and engages in constant skirmishes with the Philistines. But the divine favor, it seems, can be a fickle thing. Saul, in a moment of impatient hubris, performs a sacrifice himself instead of waiting for Samuel, an act deemed an infringement on priestly duties. It's a reminder that even divinely appointed kings have rules to follow. This leads to Samuel's stern declaration that Saul's kingdom will not endure. You can practically hear the dramatic soundtrack swell at that point. And so you witness the emergence of a new chosen leader, a young shepherd boy named David, again anointed by Samuel, even while Saul is still on the throne. This period of transition, where two divinely chosen leaders exist simultaneously, highlights the complex theological and political landscape of the time. The transition from charismatic judges to hereditary monarchy was not a smooth, linear progression. It was fraught with internal conflict and divine interventions. Historians still argue whether the accounts of this early monarchy, particularly the details surrounding Saul's rise and fall, are entirely literal historical narratives, or if they contain significant theological embellishments designed to underscore particular messages about obedience and divine will. You watch as David, with his eventual rise to power, consolidates the kingdom, establishes Jerusalem as the capital, and institutes a more centralized administration, complete with taxes and a more structured military. The idea of king here morphs from a temporary, divinely empowered rescuer into a permanent, hereditary ruler, responsible for both the spiritual well-being and the geopolitical stability of the nation. It's a profound shift, you realize, from a fluid, almost anarchic system to one that begins to resemble the more familiar structures of power you've seen in other ancient civilizations. The foundations of a new kind of kingship, one intertwined with a unique covenant between a people and their God, are now firmly laid in the desert sands. You blink and the dry, dusty plains of ancient Israel, where prophets once anointed kings, shimmer and dissolve. Now you're standing on a sun-drenched Aegean shore, the air thick with the scent of salt and pine, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing from a nascent city. The light here feels different, sharper, illuminating marble temples and bustling agoras where the very idea of absolute rule is. Well, it's a bit of a conversational punchline. People here, they're arguing, debating, and frankly, if you stuck around too long, trying to navigate their political squabbles and sudden exiles, you probably won't survive this. Their idea of a king is about as welcome as a tax increase, unless you're talking about the good old days, and even then, it's complicated. You see, while some cultures were busy prostrating themselves before god-kings and dynastic emperors, the various city-states of classical Greece were busy having a collective identity crisis about who should actually be in charge. Remember the pharaohs, those living gods whose decrees were law, their power radiating from the sun itself. Or the Chinese emperors, legitimized by the mandate of heaven, a cosmic endorsement of their family's right to rule. Well, the Greeks, bless their argumentative hearts, largely looked at that setup and said, "Thanks, but no thanks. We've got some thoughts of our own." They were, in essence, the original disruptors of the kingship model. The term they did use, basileus, is fascinatingly slippery, like trying to hold onto a particularly well-oiled olive. It didn't always mean king in the sense of a powerful, hereditary monarch. In the earliest Mycenaean period, from which you might recall grand palace complexes and warlike rulers, the Wanax was the big cheese, a true king with significant religious and military authority. The basileus back then was more of a local chieftain or a regional lord, a bit like a duke or a baron, answering to the Wanax. But as the Bronze Age collapsed, a messy affair involving lots of burning and very few surviving spreadsheets, the monarchs disappeared, leaving the basileus to fill the vacuum. And fill it they did, but often in a much diminished capacity. Imagine a village meeting, but instead of the mayor, it's the guy who owns the biggest herd of goats and can swing a sword without falling over. That's your early Dark Age basileus. His power wasn't inherited by divine right, nor was it absolute. It was usually based on his ability to lead in battle, dispense justice, and maintain the peace among his fellow citizens, or, more accurately, his fellow free men. He was often just primus inter pares, first among equals, which, let's be honest, sounds far less glamorous than son of Ra. Sometimes he was elected. Sometimes he was chosen by lot. It was less about a crown and more about a really uncomfortable chair at the head of the village council. As these small communities grew into the sophisticated city-states you're now wandering through, the role of the basileus evolved again, often fading into the background or becoming purely ceremonial. Take Athens, for instance. Initially they had kings, yes, but over time, power shifted. By the classical period, you see a group of officials called archons, elected annually, taking over most of the executive functions. One of them, the archon basileus, still retained some of the king's old religious duties, like overseeing sacrifices and ancient religious trials. So while a basileus technically existed, his job was less command armies and build pyramids, and more make sure the festival offerings are correctly counted. It's like being the official keeper of the ancient napkin collection at a grand estate important for tradition, but not for day-to-day power. This move away from kingship wasn't accidental. It was a conscious rejection, a hard-learned lesson from periods of tyrannical rule. The very concept of tyrannies, rule by an absolute individual, was anathema to the Greek spirit of collective decision-making and civic participation. They preferred systems where power was distributed, debated, and ideally temporary. You see this in the development of oligarchy, where a few wealthy or aristocratic families held sway, or most famously in the birth of democracy in Athens, where male citizens could directly participate in governance. It's hard to imagine, after witnessing the godlike awe given to the pharaohs, that a society would willingly vote itself into a system where everyone gets a say, even if that everyone was a relatively small percentage of the actual population. Historians still argue whether the transition from Mycenaean monarchs to the classical Greek basileus, and the subsequent rejection of kingship, was a gradual, organic process driven by economic and social changes, or a more deliberate, even revolutionary shift in political thought. Was it a natural evolution of tribal leadership into something more egalitarian, or a specific intellectual movement that consciously sought to dismantle the idea of singular, inherited power? The truth, as always with history, is probably a messy combination of both. Even Sparta, the famously militaristic city-state, had kings, but they had two of them ruling concurrently. Two kings from two different hereditary lines, each with specific roles, balancing each other out. One usually led the army, the other managed affairs at home. It was a kingship designed with built-in checks and balances, a far cry from the all-encompassing authority of, say, King David, whose chosen status derived directly from divine decree. The Spartan model highlights the Greek reluctance to place unchecked power in the hands of a single individual, even when they retain the title of king. It's almost like they were saying, okay, fine, you can be a king, but you get a co-worker, and you have to split the scepter, and no, you can't have the really cool crown. Their system, while stable for centuries, was unique, a fascinating adaptation of a very old title into a very different political reality. This aversion to solo supreme rule permeated their culture, influencing their philosophy, their plays, and their endless debates in the public square. They weren't inventing the idea of a king. They were actively uninventing it, or at least radically redefining it. You stand on one of Rome's legendary 7 hills, the air thick with the scent of pine and dust, the murmur of a nascent city below. The Tiber River, a silvery ribbon, snakes through the valley, reflecting a sky that promises both glory and profound change. Imagine the cramped, bustling alleys, the shouts of merchants, the lowing of cattle, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. This isn't the marble metropolis you picture from postcards. This is a rough-and-tumble settlement, growing, clawing its way from humble beginnings. You can almost feel the cobblestones under your bare feet, surprisingly cool, even though they're probably just packed earth right now. For centuries, Rome was ruled by kings, much like some of those ancient civilizations we whispered about earlier. Not quite the living gods of Egypt, nor the chosen ones of Israel, but powerful figures nonetheless. They were the arbiters of law, the commanders in war, the chief priests. You might imagine them in grand robes, seated on thrones of carved wood, holding scepters that gleamed with whatever precious metals they could scrounge up. The story, as the Romans loved to tell it, began with Romulus, a twin suckled by a she-wolf, a rather dramatic origin story for any city, wouldn't you agree? It certainly beats finding your city's origin in a local zoning dispute. Now, let's be real. If you were around during this foundational period, jostling for space in the Roman Forum, which was probably just a muddy marketplace back then, you'd find life less than idyllic. Disease, famine, the constant threat of tribal skirmishes. You probably won't survive this, dear listener, not unless you were one of the very few well-fed, well-protected elite. Most folks just hope to make it through another harvest without getting speared by a Sabine. Tradition speaks of 7 kings of Rome, though the lines between myth and history blur faster than a Roman laundress's water bucket. The last of these, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus Tarquin the Proud, was, by all accounts, a tyrant of epic proportions. He was said to have seized power violently, executed senators, and generally made life miserable for everyone who wasn't himself or his sycophantic buddies. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed an act so heinous, the rape of Lucretia, that it ignited a fire of rebellion that would reshape the entire course of Roman history. The Romans, weary of despotic rule and disgusted by the royal family's moral decay, expelled them in 509 BCE. This act wasn't just a change of leadership. It was a profound declaration that Rome would never again bow to the arbitrary will of a single man. No more kings, ever. Well, at least not in name. In place of a single king, Rome embraced a revolutionary concept, a republic. This meant power was distributed among elected officials. 2 consuls, elected annually, held executive authority, sharing command of the army and the administration of justice. You can almost hear the sighs of relief from the Roman populace. 2 bosses? Excellent! Now they can argue amongst themselves while we get on with our lives. And beneath them, the mighty Senate, an assembly of elders, mostly drawn from the aristocratic patrician class, whose wisdom and sometimes stubbornness guided the state. It was a complex dance of checks and balances, designed specifically to prevent any one individual from accumulating too much power. Imagine trying to explain that to a pharaoh. You mean your living God only gets to rule for a year, and he has a co-worker? What madness is this? One of the most enduring symbols of this new republican ideal was Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus. The story goes that in 458 BCE, Rome was in a desperate pickle, besieged by the Equi tribe. The Senate, in their wisdom, decided to appoint Cincinnatus as dictator, a temporary, absolute ruler given extraordinary powers during a crisis, but only for 6 months. Where did they find him? Plowing his modest farm, minding his own business, probably humming a little tune about turnips. He took command, utterly crushed the Equi in a matter of days, celebrated his triumph, and then, get this, immediately resigned his dictatorship and returned to his farm, all within 16 days. No clinging to power, no demanding monuments, just jobs done, back to the plow. It's a level of civic virtue that makes you wonder if he just really hated public speaking. Or perhaps he had a very important turnip crop to attend to. Now, historians still argue whether the traditional account of Rome's early kings and the swift, dramatic transition to a republic is entirely accurate, or if it's a later, idealized narrative crafted by Roman historians to paint a picture of their noble origins. Was Tarquin really that bad, or was he just a convenient villain for the Republicans to rally against? And did the Republic truly spring into being fully formed, or was it a more gradual, messy evolution of power structures? Some scholars suggest the early kings might have been more like tribal chieftains whose powers slowly waned as the collective influence of the elite grew. It's almost like trying to figure out if your great-great-great-grandparents really did invent the spork, or if they just bought one at a novelty shop and told a tall tale. Despite their aversion to kings, the Romans would, centuries later, find themselves back under the rule of a single man, though he would bear a different title, emperor. How did this happen? It wasn't an overnight coup. The Republic, for all its genius, was designed for a small city-state, not a vast, expanding empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. As Rome grew, its institutions strained under the weight of governing distant provinces, managing colossal armies, and dealing with internal strife. Powerful generals, like Marius and Sulla, then Pompey and Caesar, began to dominate the political landscape, their personal ambitions and loyalties of their legions often overshadowing the Senate's authority. The very system designed to prevent tyranny inadvertently created the conditions for it. You see, when you give someone enough power to save the state from chaos, they often decide they quite like that power. The final nail in the Republic's coffin was hammered in by Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus. After defeating his rivals in a series of brutal civil wars, he carefully, meticulously dismantled the Republic not by force, at least, not overtly, but by gradually accumulating power under the guise of restoring stability. He never called himself king. Oh no, that word was anathema. Instead, he presented himself as the Princeps Civitatis, the first citizen. He held multiple key Republican offices simultaneously, controlled the army, and influenced every aspect of Roman life, all while maintaining the illusion that the Senate still held sway. It was a masterclass in rebranding absolute power. You can imagine him saying, "Look, I'm just here to help out. Someone's got to manage this spreadsheet, right? And maybe just command all the legions. You know, for safety." And so Rome, once a kingdom, then a fiercely independent republic, transformed into an empire ruled by a series of emperors, some wise, some mad, some utterly forgettable. This imperial model, for all its pomp and power, carried echoes of the very kings they had so vehemently rejected, albeit with better PR and a much larger territory. The idea of a single supreme ruler, whether called king, emperor, pharaoh, or princeps, kept bubbling up throughout history. It seems that even after experiencing the perils of unchecked authority, humanity often finds itself returning to that singular figure on the throne, perhaps out of a longing for order, perhaps out of a deeply ingrained need for a strong leader, or perhaps simply because someone thought it would be a really cool title. Imagine standing on a vast, dusty plain, the horizon stretching endlessly before you, not just for miles, but for weeks, for months of tireless travel. You've journeyed through civilizations that thought kings were divine, others that tried to escape them, and still others that saw emperors as military necessities. You've seen Rome, that formidable beast, grapple with its own ideas of leadership, tumbling from kings to a republic, then ultimately embracing emperors, all within a relatively familiar Mediterranean sphere. But now you must shift your gaze. Far, far to the east, beyond the familiar shores of the Aegean, lies a realm so immense, so sprawling, that it makes even the mighty Roman Empire look like a meticulously tended garden plot. This is Persia, the Achaemenid Empire, and its rulers faced a challenge of scale that dwarfed everything that had come before. How, you might ask yourself, do you even begin to govern a territory that stretches from the sun-baked banks of the Indus River in the east, all the way to the blue waters of the Aegean Sea in the west? How do you command allegiance from peoples living in the fertile Nile Delta, the cold mountains of Anatolia, and the vast, arid steppes north of the Black Sea all at once? You don't just need a king, you need the king. You need a concept so grand, so utterly overarching, that it naturally elevates its bearer above all other mere mortals who happen to wear a crown, wield a scepter, or merely govern a province. And so you invent the King of Kings, Shahanshah. This wasn't just some pompous vanity title like calling your cat Fluffy, supreme overlord of the sofa. No, it was a pragmatic necessity born of unimaginable imperial ambition. The Persian Empire, at its zenith under figures like Darius the Great, was the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, controlling an estimated 44% of the world's population. Let that sink in for a moment, nearly half the known human race, bowing, directly or indirectly, before one single individual. You, dear listener, had you existed in that ancient age, would most certainly have been counted among them. And let's be brutally honest, surviving the sheer travel alone across such distances, not to mention avoiding the various local skirmishes or the ever-present threat of dysentery, means you probably wouldn't have made it to see the King of Kings yourself. But your taxes, your labor, your very existence would have been subject to his will. Imagine the logistical nightmare of governing such a gargantuan domain. To manage this immense territory, the Achaemenids devised a brilliant, if utterly complex, administrative system of satrapies, provinces, each governed by a satrap. These satraps were often loyal members of the royal family or highly trusted nobles, acting as the King of Kings' direct representatives. But here's the clever part. Even these satraps were, in essence, kings in their own right within their territories, wielding considerable autonomy. They maintained their local laws, collected their own taxes, and even commanded local armies, so long as they paid their substantial annual tribute to the great king, supplied their mandated soldiers, and crucially never, ever forgot who was truly in charge. The King of Kings was the absolute apex of this towering pyramid of power. Cyrus the Great, the empire's visionary founder, masterfully consolidated countless disparate kingdoms and tribes under his banner, offering a remarkable degree of cultural and religious tolerance. Darius I, the administrative genius, refined this system, building monumental cities like Persepolis and constructing the famous Royal Road, a superhighway of its time that allowed royal messengers and armies to traverse the empire with unprecedented speed. They understood that you simply couldn't micromanage every village, every temple, every caravan across such a vast expanse. Instead, you create a system where local rulers maintain their power and traditions, as long as they unequivocally acknowledge your supreme authority. It's almost like a modern CEO overseeing dozens of regional managers, who in turn manage smaller teams. Except, if a regional manager rebelled, they usually ended up, shall we say, very publicly displayed, which tends to discourage repeat offenses. Just a little difference from your typical corporate HR meeting. And speaking of the consequences of displeasing the King of Kings, consider this quirky tidbit. The fate of Orotes, a satrap of Lydia. This ambitious fellow grew a little too powerful, even executing a royal messenger and making himself generally obnoxious. Darius, rather than mobilizing a massive army for a distant campaign, simply sent a royal scribe with a series of coded messages. One message, read aloud, simply ordered Orotes' own guards to kill him. And they did, just like that. Because the will of the King of Kings was absolute, even from thousands of miles away. It's like your boss sending an email that quietly deactivates your office keycard. But, with far more permanent consequences. This highly decentralized yet ultimately absolute system leads to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this system of satrapies, while undeniably effective for maintaining control over such an immense territory, truly fostered deep loyalty among the various peoples and local rulers, or whether it merely managed a constant, underlying tension. Was it a stable, sophisticated model of decentralized power, or a perpetual ticking time bomb of regional ambitions, held in check only by the King of Kings' awe-inspiring power and terrifyingly swift justice? Imagine the whisper of rich silk robes in the opulent, columned halls of Persepolis, the intoxicating scent of exotic spices carried on the desert wind, the rhythmic, intimidating thud of thousands of marching feet as the King of Kings' immortals, his elite guard, passed by. You can almost feel the weight of that ornate crown, a crown that wasn't just a symbol of power, but a definitive declaration. I am the one who rules all who rule. And this wasn't about being a living god like the pharaohs, who, you might recall, were perfectly happy slathering themselves in crocodile dung sunscreen. No, this was about being the ultimate mortal authority, the grand architect of an empire that defied geographical limits and encompassed nearly the entire known world. This concept of an overarching monarch, a suzerain over other kings and rulers, would profoundly influence later empires, from the Sasanian Persians who would revive the title, to the caliphs of the Islamic world, and even indirectly, the Holy Roman emperors who sought to unite disparate European kingdoms under their own grand, if often contested, authority. The King of Kings wasn't just a title. It was a blueprint for universal dominion, a whisper in the wind that echoed across millennia. I am the ultimate boss. You stand amidst the dust of what was once an empire, a vast dominion stretched thin across continents, forged by a single whirlwind personality. The air still hums with the echoes of triumph, but beneath that sound, a new, unsettling quiet has fallen. He's gone, the man who believed he could simply conquer the world and then, what? Go home and enjoy a nice cup of tea. Not quite. Now the heavy crown, once worn by a singular titan, has shattered into 1,000 gleaming shards, each piece attracting a new contender. You feel the tremor in the ground beneath your sandals. It's not an earthquake, but the distant rumble of armies, each led by one of his generals, all vying for their own piece of the grand pie. If you were actually here, caught between these colossal egos, you probably wouldn't survive this, by the way. Your chances are roughly equivalent to a chocolate ice cream cone in a heat wave. This is the chaotic birth of the Hellenistic successor kingdoms, a period where the very idea of kingship underwent a dramatic, often violent, metamorphosis. Remember how the Achaemenids had their King of Kings, a grand, almost cosmic title meant to encompass vastness. Well, after Alexander, you get many kings. It's less King of Kings and more everyone gets a king. Look under your seat. His sudden demise left a power vacuum so enormous it practically sucked in everything around it. No clear heir, no designated successor, just a bunch of battle-hardened generals, the Diadachi as they'd come to be known, staring at each other across maps, each wondering if they could truly fill the colossal boots of the departed conqueror. You watch as the map of the known world redraws itself in real time, less like careful cartography and more like a child's crayon scribble. The most powerful of these generals, men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus, didn't just inherit territory. They inherited the very concept of absolute rule, filtered through the lens of Alexander's almost divine persona. Ptolemy, shrewd and pragmatic, grabbed Egypt, creating a dynasty that would last for nearly 3 centuries, right up to the doorstep of a certain Roman general and his famously sharp nose. He saw the Nile's predictable bounty and thought, now that's a stable tax base. Smart man. Meanwhile, Seleucus, perhaps the most ambitious in terms of sheer landmass, scooped up the vast eastern territories, founding the gargantuan Seleucid Empire stretching from Anatolia all the way to India. Imagine trying to run that from a single capital. It's like managing a global corporation where your email takes 6 months to arrive. And then there's Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, who briefly tried to reunite the whole sprawling mess under his single, cycloptic gaze. Spoiler alert, it didn't quite work out. The sheer logistical nightmare, let alone the ambition of his rivals, proved too much. What's fascinating about these new monarchies is how they blended Greek culture with the indigenous traditions they encountered. You'd see pharaohs speaking Greek, Persian satraps adopting Hellenic military tactics, and grand new cities like Alexandria in Egypt or Antioch in Syria becoming thriving centers of learning and trade. These weren't just military outposts, they were cultural melting pots, often simmered on a high heat. The rulers weren't just kings. They were patrons of the arts, founders of libraries, and often, in the case of the Ptolemies, rather enthusiastic about marrying their own siblings. Talk about keeping the power in the family. They really took that advice to heart. You have to wonder how those family dinners went. Pass the salt, brother husband. This wasn't just a simple continuation of past kingships either. Unlike the pharaohs who were born divine, these Hellenistic kings had to assert their divinity, or at least a semi-divine status. They built cults around themselves, minted coins with their idealized portraits, and often adopted titles that hinted at godlike authority. Alexander had been worshipped, so why shouldn't they? It's a bit like someone winning the lottery, and then all their distant cousins suddenly claiming they're also lottery winners by association. Historians still argue whether this self-deification was a genuine belief system, a cynical power play, or just a necessary evolution in legitimizing rule in a world that had just witnessed the meteoric rise and fall of a mortal man worshipped as a god. Consider Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Seleucid king who famously dubbed himself Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. He wasn't exactly subtle. He even tried to Hellenize the Jews, leading to the Maccabean revolt, not exactly a successful rebranding effort on his part. But it highlights the core struggle. How do you establish legitimate rule in territories that have just been conquered, then reconquered, then fought over again by ambitious generals? You create a new narrative, often one that elevates you above mere mortals. It's the ultimate PR campaign, but with actual armies as your marketing budget. So, while the idea of a king had existed for millennia, from Sumerian priest kings to Egyptian god kings, the Hellenistic period introduced a different flavor: the self-made king. These weren't necessarily chosen by divine mandate in the traditional sense, or by ancient lineage. They took it, and then they had to justify it, often through military might, economic prosperity, and clever propaganda that linked them back to Alexander himself. It's a powerful lesson in branding, really, centuries before the concept was even invented. You see how the idea of a king is ever evolving, isn't it? It's a concept as fluid as the shifting sands of the empires themselves. Imperial Roman monarchy, the subtle reemergence of single-person rule in Rome. You've traversed the vast, sun-baked plains where Alexander's successors carved out their kingdoms, each vying for a throne, each boldly proclaiming themselves a king. You saw them bedecked in diadems, asserting their divine right or, at the very least, their right by conquest. But now you step onto the cobbled streets of a different power, a city that, for centuries, had shuddered at the very word king. Rome. Imagine yourself here, amidst the hustle and bustle of the Forum, the scent of baking bread mingling with the distant clamor of construction. The air is thick with the murmur of Latin, the clatter of senatorial sandals, and the quiet hum of an empire that, perhaps unbeknownst to many of its citizens, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, circling back to the very idea it had once so vehemently rejected. You're standing, perhaps, near the rostra, listening to a senator declaim, passionately defending the Republic, yet you can feel the subtle shift in the air, a gravitational pull towards a single, powerful figure. It's a bit like watching a truly massive pendulum swing, slower than you'd ever believe, but inexorably heading back to its starting point, even if it tries to rename itself on the way. And frankly, if you were a Roman citizen back then, trying to navigate these political currents, you probably wouldn't survive the shifting loyalties for long. Just a gentle heads up. Rome, remember, had thrown out its kings, the Tarquins, with such force that the very concept of a rex, a king, became anathema. To be called rex in Republican Rome was an insult, practically a death sentence, a sign of tyranny. So, when one man, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus, finally brought an end to the brutal civil wars that had torn the Republic apart, he knew better than to dust off an old crown. He understood the deep-seated Roman aversion to overt monarchy. Instead, he embarked on one of history's most brilliant and enduring political rebrands. He didn't declare himself king. Oh no, that would be terribly uncouth. Instead, he simply became first, the princeps, the first citizen. He curated his image with the meticulousness of a modern-day celebrity PR team, always appearing humble, always deferring to the Senate, at least on the surface. He simply restored the Republic, he claimed. by accumulating an unprecedented array of existing republican powers into his own hands. You see, he was granted Imperium's supreme military command for life, which meant he controlled all the legions. He also became tribunicia potestas, the power of a tribune, which gave him sacrosanctity, meaning you couldn't lay a hand on him without facing divine retribution, which is handy for job security and the power to veto any law. Imagine having the ultimate nuh-uh button for all legislation. Pretty sweet deal, right? And then, just for good measure, he became Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, intertwining religious authority with his temporal might. He was the commander-in-chief, the chief legislator, and the chief spiritual leader, all rolled into one unassuming toga. It was a masterclass in soft power, a subtle reemergence of single-person rule so artfully disguised that many Romans genuinely believed their republic had been saved, not subtly dismantled and reassembled around one man. This accumulation of titles, rather than a single kingly one, allowed him to bypass the deeply ingrained cultural hatred for monarchy. It was a clever, if slightly deceptive, bit of political jujitsu. He was effectively a king in all but name, a monarch disguised as a super-citizen. This period, known as the Principate, saw the emperor become the ultimate arbiter of power, the focal point of the vast Roman world. They might have kept the Senate, the consuls, and the various republican offices, but their power was increasingly advisory, their influence a mere shadow of what it had been. It's like keeping the old packaging for a product, but filling it with something entirely new and far more potent. Still 100% Republic-y, the label might as well have proclaimed, while inside, a full-blown autocracy was brewing. One quirky tidbit about this shift is how closely Augustus managed his public image. He had statues made of himself looking eternally youthful, projecting an image of stability and peace, a stark contrast to the chaos of the civil wars. He even lived relatively modestly on the Palatine Hill, avoiding the overt opulence of earlier Hellenistic kings, further cementing his first citizen persona. This careful crafting of public perception was crucial. The Romans were accustomed to civic virtue and simplicity, and Augustus tapped into that, presenting himself not as a distant, deified monarch, but as a hardworking public servant. Though later emperors would certainly embrace the grandeur, Augustus set the stage for a unique kind of monarchy, one built on a foundation of republican rhetoric. Yet, despite all the elaborate charades, the question remained. How would succession work? The Republic had relied on elections, on rotating offices. A princeps for life didn't fit that model. Augustus wrestled with this, eventually settling on a system of adoption, grooming a successor from within his own family. This effectively created a dynasty, even if it wasn't hereditary in the traditional sense, laying the groundwork for the Julio-Claudian emperors who followed. Each successive emperor inherited a system where personal power overshadowed republican institutions, gradually eroding the memory of what a true republic felt like. Historians still argue whether the early Principate was truly a monarchy in disguise, or a unique constitutional experiment that gradually devolved into autocracy. It's a fascinating debate, pondering whether Augustus was a pragmatic savior of Rome or its most cunning destroyer of freedom. By the time you reach the later emperors like Nero or Domitian, the facade had worn thin. The deification of emperors, which began cautiously with Augustus, who was deified posthumously, became increasingly common and immediate, echoing the divine kingships of Egypt and the Near East. Temples were built to living emperors, and their images were revered. The emperor, no longer just the first citizen, was increasingly seen as a god on earth, a sacred figure whose will was law. The Roman people, tired of war and craving stability, largely accepted this new reality. After centuries of fearing the crown, they embraced the peace and prosperity that a centralized, single-person rule seemed to bring, even if it meant sacrificing the ancient republican ideal. The idea of a king had returned to Rome, not through conquest or revolution, but through a masterful act of political illusion, a gradual, almost imperceptible transformation, like watching a caterpillar slowly, beautifully, turn into a butterfly. Only this butterfly had legions and the power of life and death over millions. You find yourself standing on a muddy road, not the meticulously paved arteries of Roman engineering you remember, but a rutted track winding through fields where ruins stand like skeletal giants against the gray sky. The wind whispers through skeletal arches, carrying the faint, unsettling scent of wood smoke and something wilder. The grand villas, once vibrant with life and laughter, are now hollowed-out shells, their mosaics cracked, their frescoes fading under the relentless damp. This isn't the carefully manicured, bureaucratic machine of the late Roman Empire. This is raw, visceral, and utterly unpredictable. You see figures moving in the distance, not legions in gleaming armor, but groups of men wrapped in furs and homespun wool, carrying crude spears or heavy axes. Their languages are guttural and strange, a jarring counterpoint to the soft Latin hum that once permeated every corner of this land. The imperial banners are gone, replaced by simpler, often animalistic, standards. If you thought navigating modern bureaucracy was tough, try doing it when the local road maintenance crew has decided to become a band of horsemen who just, take your stuff. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. Out of this profound rupture, this societal earthquake, a new kind of kingship began to crystallize, not in the marble halls of Rome, but in the drafty wooden longhouses and makeshift fortresses across a fracturing continent. The idea of the king wasn't invented here. No, you remember our journey through Sumerian city-states and Egyptian god-kings. But it was being radically reinvented. The concept of divine authority, of a universal imperium stretching across vast, diverse populations, was crumbling like an old fresco. In its place, personal loyalty, military prowess, and the ability to simply keep your tribe from starving or being overrun by the next wave of newcomers became the bedrock of power. These were the barbarian kings, a term that, perhaps unfairly, conjures images of unthinking destruction. In reality, many of these new rulers were keenly aware of the sophisticated ruins they now inhabited. They didn't just smash things. They tried, often clumsily, to repurpose them. They saw the remnants of Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman infrastructure, and thought, hey, this could be useful. It was like a corporate takeover, but with more beards and considerably fewer spreadsheets. Take the Goths, for example. The Visigoths, having famously sacked Rome in 410 CE, eventually settled in Hispania, modern-day Spain. Their kings, like Euric, started codifying laws, blending their Germanic customs with Roman legal traditions. They wore Roman-style tunics, adopted Roman bureaucratic titles, and even minted coins that mimicked Roman designs. They were trying to look the part, to project an image of continuity and legitimate succession, even if their actual power base was entirely different. Then there were the Ostrogoths in Italy, led by Theodoric the Great. He ruled from Ravenna, a city that still boasts incredible Byzantine mosaics from his era. Theodoric sought to foster a dual society, where Goths provided military protection and Romans maintained their administrative and cultural traditions. He was famously tolerant, a Gothic king who respected Roman institutions, even if he did have a habit of executing rivals who disagreed with his vision a bit too strongly. Imagine trying to explain tax reform to someone whose idea of a stable economy involves slightly more cows than yours. But perhaps the most successful of these new monarchs was Clovis I, king of the Franks. His crucial move wasn't just military conquest, though he was certainly good at that. It was his conversion to Nicene Christianity around 496 CE, while many other Germanic tribes were Arian Christians, a different theological branch. Clovis embraced the same form of Christianity as the majority of the Gallo-Roman population he now ruled. This gave him immense legitimacy in the eyes of the populace and, crucially, the powerful Catholic Church. It turned his rule from a mere barbarian occupation into a divinely sanctioned mission, paving the way for the mighty Merovingian dynasty that would shape early medieval France. His baptism wasn't just a spiritual act. It was a power move, a spiritual embrace, and a political masterstroke all rolled into one rather damp, probably smelly event. The power of these kings wasn't merely inherited. It was earned through constant warfare, shrewd alliances, and the ability to hold together disparate groups of people in a period of intense flux. Their authority rested heavily on their personal prestige, their military success, and their relationship with their comitatus, a loyal warband who fought for their leader in exchange for plunder and patronage. It was a brutal meritocracy where failure on the battlefield could mean losing your head, your kingdom, and your very name from history. And while things were undeniably chaotic and often violent, there were attempts at establishing a sense of order. Remember that quirky tidbit about ancient legal systems? Here's another one. Many of these Germanic kingdoms developed complex compensation systems for injuries or deaths, known as Wehrgeld or man-money. Rather than an endless cycle of blood feuds, if you harmed someone, you paid a specific sum based on the victim's social status. Killing a king, of course, carried the highest Wehrgeld, often an impossibly large sum designed to deter anyone from even thinking about it. So, while you might lose an eye, at least you'd get some serious cash, or perhaps a herd of cattle for your troubles. A strange blend of brutal reality and an almost bureaucratic attempt at legalistic peace. Historians still argue whether the fall of Rome was a sudden, cataclysmic collapse or a gradual transformation, a slow, creaking pivot rather than a dramatic toppling. Were these barbarian kings the destroyers of a civilization, or were they the reluctant inheritors, trying to put back together a broken toy using new, often improvised tools? The truth, as ever, is probably somewhere in the middle. They certainly pulled the rug out from under the old order, but they also laid the foundations for the new political map of Europe, birthing the very idea of nations ruled by a new kind of monarch. The legacy of these warrior kings, their struggles, their adaptations, and their brutal, often brilliant, solutions would echo through the coming centuries, shaping the very nature of power on a continent forever changed. You feel the chills seep into your bones as you stand on the flagstones, the air thick with the scent of damp straw and roasting meat. High overhead, banners depicting heraldic beasts flutter, their heavy silk muted by the perpetual gloom of the vast hall. A murmur ripples through the assembled throng, and then a sudden hush. Every eye, including yours, turns to the dais. There he sits, the king, not just a ruler, not merely a warlord, but something more profound. He wears a crown, heavy with jewels, But the true weight isn't in the gold and gems. It's in the invisible mantle of power he claims. You're in the heart of medieval Europe, where the very idea of a king has been reforged, hammered into a concept far more enduring and far-reaching than almost anything that came before. This isn't the transient chieftain or the elected consul. This is the anointed, the chosen, the very embodiment of the divine on earth. It's a heavy role, both for him and for you, because in this era your life, quite literally, hinges on his whim. And let's be honest, surviving medieval Europe is a dicey proposition at the best of times. You probably won't survive this, what with the lack of antibiotics, the questionable hygiene, and the constant threat of being drafted into some noble's endless squabble over a muddy field. But hey, at least the king gets a comfy chair. The barbarian kings who carved up the remnants of the Roman Empire, remember them. They started with a certain rough and ready authority, often rooted in military prowess or tribal lineage. But as their nascent kingdoms stabilized, as the dust settled from Rome's grand collapse, something deeper began to take root. They needed a more robust, more universal justification for their rule than just being the biggest bully with the sharpest sword. And so the concept of divine right was hauled back out of the historical closet, dusted off, and given a glorious, gilded makeover. You see, the Christian Church, now the dominant spiritual force across much of Europe, played a pivotal role in this transformation. Kings weren't just powerful men. They were God's viceroys, his chosen instruments. They were crowned not just by men, but by God himself, or at least by his representatives on earth, the bishops and archbishops. The anointing oil poured over their heads during coronation was a physical manifestation of this spiritual blessing. It meant challenging the king wasn't just treason against a mortal ruler. It was blasphemy against God. Imagine the ultimate, my dad is stronger than your dad argument. Except your dad is, omnipotent. This divine mandate gave kings an unparalleled legitimacy, cementing their position in a way that even the mightiest Roman emperor, who often had to rely on legions and political maneuvering, couldn't always claim so universally. The crown wasn't merely a symbol of authority. It was a physical manifestation of a sacred covenant. Every decision, every war, every decree was theoretically guided by divine will, placing an immense, almost unbearable pressure on the monarch, who was accountable not just to his subjects, but to God himself. This concept, known as Rex Gratia Dei, king by the grace of God, wasn't just a fancy motto. It was the bedrock of medieval monarchical power. It permeated everything from law codes to epic poems. Even if a king was a complete disaster, cruel, incompetent, or just really bad at chess, his legitimacy was rarely questioned on the grounds of his personal failings, but rather through the lens of God's mysterious plan. You might grumble about his taxes or his latest fashion faux pas, but openly defying him was a ticket to a very short, very painful future. But divine right wasn't the only pillar holding up this new structure. Alongside it, an intricate web of relationships known as feudalism took hold. You can almost feel the threads of obligation stretching out from the king. He owned all the land, well, technically, God did, but the king was managing it for him. He couldn't possibly administer every village, every field, every muddy pigsty directly. So he granted large tracts of land, called fiefs, to his most loyal nobles, dukes, counts, barons. In return, these nobles swore fealty, pledging military service, counsel, and financial aid. They became his vassals. It was a mutual support system. If by mutual, you mean the king got almost everything and the nobles got land but also had to fight his wars. And what did the nobles do with their land? They subdivided it further, granting smaller parcels to knights and lesser lords, who in turn had their own vassals. At the very bottom of this elaborate pyramid were you, the peasants, the serfs, tied to the land, working it for your lord, who worked it for his lord, who worked it for the king. Your days were spent toiling in the fields, producing food not just for your family, but for everyone above you in the hierarchy. You paid rent in crops, perhaps chickens, and certainly in labor, patching up the lord's castle walls or mending his fences. It was like a giant, very slow-moving pyramid scheme. But instead of cash, the currency was loyalty, land, and the occasional pig. And speaking of pigs, or rather, the practicalities of kingship, one quirky detail that exemplifies the divine aura surrounding medieval kings was the belief in the king's touch. Many medieval monarchs, particularly in England and France, were believed to possess the miraculous ability to cure scrofula, a lymphatic disease, often called the king's evil, by simply laying their hands upon the afflicted. Imagine waiting in line, hoping the king's blessing would sort out your swollen glands. It was a powerful public relations stunt, certainly, reinforcing the idea that these rulers weren't just mortal men, but vessels of God's healing power. Of course, it also meant the king had to spend a lot of time touching sick people, which, given the overall state of medieval hygiene, sounds like a job requirement you'd politely decline. This was not just folklore. It was an integral part of the monarch's public image, a tangible connection to the divine. Historians still argue whether the concept of divine right was genuinely and universally believed by the populace, or if it was primarily a political tool wielded by monarchs and the church to control unruly nobles and keep the peasantry in line. Was it deeply ingrained faith or clever propaganda? Did people truly believe their king could perform miracles, or was it a convenient narrative to reinforce power? The truth, as often happens, likely lies somewhere in the murky middle, a complex tapestry of genuine spiritual conviction interwoven with shrewd political pragmatism. The church itself, while often validating the king's divine right, also possessed its own immense power, sometimes clashing with monarchs over jurisdiction, appointments, or even moral authority. It was a delicate dance, this power sharing between the temporal and the spiritual, each reinforcing, yet sometimes challenging, the other. So you see a system emerging where the king is no longer just the most powerful warrior or the luckiest survivor. He is a figure invested with sacred authority, sitting atop a meticulously structured social hierarchy. This framework, a blend of religious sanction and socio-economic obligation, transformed the very nature of kingship, solidifying its hold and laying the groundwork for centuries of dynastic rule across Europe. The idea of a king wasn't just invented. It was constantly reinvented, refined, and made incredibly, almost frighteningly, durable. And as you watch the king on his throne, surrounded by his court, you understand that this isn't just about power. It's about an entire worldview, a divinely ordained order that you, as a humble medieval subject, are irrevocably part of. Africa's diverse rulers, exploring the rich tapestry of kingships across the continent. You stand on the edge of the Sahara, the vast, shimmering expanse stretching before you, an impossible ocean of sand under a sky so intensely blue it almost hurts your eyes. The sun beats down, a relentless golden hammer on the anvil of the earth. But even here in this immense ancient land, the idea of a king, a paramount ruler, has taken root and blossomed into countless forms, each as unique and resilient as the desert flora. Forget your neatly defined European monarchies. Africa, my friend, is where the concept of kingship truly gets interesting, like a chameleon changing colors on a rainbow. You're about to journey through a kaleidoscope of power, where a king might be a divine intermediary, a fierce warlord, a cunning merchant, or even, in some incredibly remote pockets, a figure whose power derives from the very rain itself. And let's be honest, traversing some of these historical landscapes, you probably won't survive this journey with your sandals intact, let alone your preconceptions. As you step across the imaginary threshold into West Africa, the air thickens with the scent of spices and the distant thrum of drums. Here, mighty empires rose and fell, powered by trade routes that snaked across the desert, carrying gold, salt, and knowledge. Think of the Ghana Empire, not to be confused with the modern nation, flourishing as early as the 4th century CE. Its kings, or Ghanas, were more than just political leaders. They were the guardians of the gold, the arbiters of justice, and the protectors of their people. They understood the power of display. Imagine their court, rich with gold, attended by musicians and royal interpreters, while outside you'd find an army ready to enforce their will. This wasn't just a king. It was a brand, a spectacle, a whole production. Then follow the gold south and west, and you arrive in the Mali Empire, a juggernaut that eclipsed Ghana. This is where you meet figures like Mansa Musa, whose pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century was so extravagant, so overflowing with gold, that he reportedly destabilized the economies of the cities he visited for years. Now that's what you call a serious flex. Mansa Musa wasn't just a king. He was an emperor, ruling over a territory larger than any contemporary European kingdom. His power stemmed from his control of trade, particularly the gold mines, but also from his adoption of Islam, which gave him a broader, more cosmopolitan legitimacy. It's a mainstream historical fact that his wealth was legendary, demonstrating how economic power could forge an empire and a new kind of monarch in Africa. Travel further east, and the landscape shifts again, leading you to the great Zimbabwe, a sprawling stone city whose ruins whisper tales of a complex society that thrived without the need for mortar to bind its colossal walls. The rulers here, likely kings or paramount chiefs, controlled vast trade networks stretching to the coast, exchanging gold and ivory for glass beads and porcelain from as far away as China. What's truly fascinating, and a quirky tidbit, is that the iconic conical tower within the great enclosure had no apparent practical function, leading many to believe it was a symbol of power, wealth, or perhaps even a granary, representing the king's ability to provide for his people. The very architecture speaks of a unique form of authority, distinct from the Sahelian empires. Historians still argue whether the decline of Great Zimbabwe was primarily due to environmental degradation, a shift in trade routes, or internal political strife, highlighting the ongoing debates about the precise nature of these ancient African states. Venture south, and you find the Zulu Kingdom, a military powerhouse forged in the early 19th century under the formidable Shaka Zulu. Here, kingship took on a decidedly more martial character. Shaka wasn't just a ruler. He was a revolutionary, transforming traditional fighting methods and creating a disciplined army that swept across southern Africa. His authority was absolute, enforced through a ruthless efficiency that, frankly, made you want to be on his good side. His legacy shows how a single, charismatic leader could entirely redefine kingship, moving from loose tribal confederations to a highly centralized, militaristic state. It's a stark reminder that the definition of a king is never static. It adapts to the needs and ambitions of its time and place, often with a good, sharp spear. And don't forget the divine kings of ancient Nubia, south of Egypt, where the pharaonic tradition continued long after its decline in Egypt itself. These Kushite kings, often buried with immense wealth and surrounded by pyramids that rivaled, in number if not in size, those of their northern neighbors, drew their authority from their connection to the gods. They even, for a time, ruled Egypt itself, showing the cyclical nature of influence and power. Or consider the Congo Kingdom in Central Africa, which engaged with European powers as early as the 15th century, with kings who adopted Christianity and tried to navigate a complex world of diplomacy and trade, often with tragic results as the transatlantic slave trade intensified. The range is simply astounding. From the sacral kings of the Shilluk people in what is now South Sudan, whose spiritual well-being was tied to the prosperity of the land, to the powerful Asantehene of the Asante Kingdom in modern-day Ghana, whose golden stool was believed to contain the very soul of the nation. African kingship defies easy categorization. It's a constant dance between the spiritual and the temporal, the inherited and the earned, the local and the global. You see how the idea of a single, central figure holding ultimate power isn't a one-size-fits-all concept. Instead, it's a testament to human ingenuity and adaptation, reflecting the diverse landscapes, economies, and belief systems that define this magnificent continent. The king, in Africa, is not just a person. He is a manifestation of community, tradition, and often an entire cosmology. You find yourself walking through a bustling marketplace, not of dusty Roman forums or medieval European squares, but one teeming with colors you've never imagined, where the air hums with strange languages and the scent of exotic spices mingles with something darker, something hinting at blood and ancient power. Here, high in the Andes, or amidst the sprawling lakes of Mesoamerica, you encounter a different kind of king. Forget the weary European monarch, perpetually worried about rebellious barons or the Pope's latest decree. These rulers, you quickly realize, operate on an entirely different plane. They aren't just leaders, they are literally, undeniably divine. You're stepping into the heart of pre-Columbian empires, where the line between mortal and God isn't just blurred, it's non-existent. And let me tell you, if you stumbled upon one of these guys the wrong way, you probably won't survive this. Their wrath, after all, isn't just human indignation, it's cosmic fury. Imagine, if you will, the Sapa Inca. He is the very embodiment of the sun god Inti. His lineage isn't just blessed by the heavens, he is the son of the sun. When he appears, carried on a golden litter adorned with feathers and jewels, common folk prostrate themselves, daring not to look him directly in the eye. You feel the weight of centuries of reverence pressing down on you as he passes, an awe that dwarfs any European king's procession. His every utterance is law, not because he commands armies, though he does, but because he is a living deity. His capital, Cusco, nestled high in the mountains, is literally shaped like a puma, a sacred animal, reflecting the cosmic order he embodies. Every stone, every terrace, every golden artifact is a testament to this profound belief system. This isn't just divine right, it's divine being. This Sapa Inca, like the one you recall from the history books, Huayna Capac, or perhaps his ill-fated successor Atahualpa, ruled an empire that stretched for thousands of miles, connected by an astonishing network of paved roads and suspension bridges, all managed without the wheel or draft animals. Talk about efficiency. You'd think building such a thing would make him more of a pragmatic engineer than a living god. But no, the two roles were intrinsically linked. His divine status justified every conquest, every relocation of people, every vast agricultural project designed to feed millions. And here's a quirky little tidbit. When a Sapa Inca died, his mummy was kept in the palace, still consulted by his descendants, and retained ownership of all his land and possessions. This meant that the new Sapa Inca had to embark on his own conquests to acquire wealth and resources for his own panaka, or royal household, rather than inheriting from his predecessor. It was like a very high-stakes, divine game of Monopoly where you couldn't inherit your dad's properties. No wonder they kept expanding. Then, shift your gaze across the vast expanse of the continent to the shimmering island city of Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire. Here, the ruler is called the Tlahtani, meaning speaker. But don't let the humble title fool you. While not explicitly a god himself in the same way as the Sapa Inca, the Tlahtani was the chosen intermediary between the human realm and the divine forces that governed the cosmos. His selection by a council of nobles and priests didn't diminish his sacred authority. Rather, it affirmed that he possessed the qualities necessary to maintain cosmic balance. You witness the solemn, terrifying rituals that unfold in the shadow of the Templo Mayor, where human sacrifice, orchestrated by the Tlahtani and his priests, is seen as a vital offering to the gods, particularly Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war deity, to ensure the sun would rise each day. It's a stark reminder that the stakes of leadership were profoundly different here. A constant negotiation with the very forces of creation and destruction. The sheer scale of these operations, the engineering marvels like the Aztec Chinampas, floating gardens that fed a city of hundreds of thousands, demonstrate an organizational capacity that rivaled any old-world empire. Yet it was all underpinned by this pervasive religious framework. The power of the king wasn't just political or military, it was deeply spiritual. Historians still argue whether the Aztec Triple Alliance, with its dominant Tenochtitlan, Tlacopan, and Texcoco, was truly an empire in the same centralized sense as the Inca, or more of a loose confederation primarily focused on extracting tribute from conquered city-states. Regardless, the Tlahtani of Tenochtitlan certainly held the most sway, his sacred duties intertwining seamlessly with his imperial ambitions. It's a leadership model that makes the divine right of European kings look like a polite suggestion in comparison. You can practically feel the weight of their spiritual responsibilities, a burden that would crush a lesser mortal. Remember how some early priest kings had to be physically perfect. These guys raised the bar significantly, often with fatal consequences if the cosmic order felt off. It wasn't exactly a job for the faint of heart, or for anyone who preferred not to be ritually bled. You've journeyed across oceans and through time, observing monarchs whose divinity was woven into the very fabric of their societies, whether through celestial mandates or jaguar god lineage. Now you pivot, crossing the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, and suddenly you're standing at the threshold of a different kind of imperial majesty, one where the idea of a king wasn't just old. It was ancient, refined, and scaled to sizes that would make your little city-state ruler from Sumeria blush. You're talking about empires so immense, so densely populated, so unfathomably wealthy, that if you tried to manage one yourself, you'd probably spontaneously combust from the sheer bureaucratic overload. Honestly, you probably won't survive even reading about it without a strong cup of chai. Imagine the hot, humid air, thick with the scent of spices and blooming jasmine. You are in Hindustan, standing at the dawn of the Mughal Empire. This isn't just a kingdom. It's a civilization unto itself, forged by Babur, a descendant of Timur and Genghis Khan, who swept in from Central Asia in the early 16th century. He wasn't just conquering land. He was laying the groundwork for a cultural fusion that would redefine kingship in India. You watch as successive emperors, like Akbar the Great, not only expand their dominion, but also craft a meticulously organized bureaucracy, a land revenue system that would make modern tax collectors weep with envy, and a court so lavish it could fund a small nation. The Mughal king, or Padishah, wasn't merely a ruler. He was the shadow of God on earth, a living embodiment of cosmic order. You're invited to attend a darbar, the emperor's public audience. The sheer opulence assaults your senses. Silks shimmer, jewels glitter, and the air hums with the low murmur of courtiers. The emperor, perhaps Shah Jahan, builder of the Taj Mahal, sits on the peacock throne, encrusted with diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, a throne so legendary it became a byword for unimaginable wealth. It's not just a seat, it's a declaration. Every gesture he makes, every word he utters, carries the weight of divine authority. You see the court artists, meticulously documenting every aspect of royal life, creating miniatures that are not just art but visual propaganda, reinforcing the emperor's grandeur and sacred status. It's a bit like a medieval reality TV show, but with significantly higher stakes and much, much better catering. One quirky tidbit you might notice, if you were a fly on the gilded wall, is the Mughal love for exotic animals. Emperors often kept menageries of lions, tigers, and even elephants, which were sometimes used in royal hunts or as a display of power. Imagine trying to explain your pet hamster to a man who owns 1,000 pounds of roaring cat. The Mughals also perfected the art of the garden, creating symmetrical paradises that mirrored their vision of an orderly universe, reflecting the king's ability to bring harmony to his realm. Historians still argue whether the administrative innovations of Akbar were truly unique, or if they were sophisticated adaptations of existing Indian bureaucratic structures. But there's no denying the sheer scale and longevity of the system he put in place. Now drift west, across the arid landscapes of Persia, and you find yourself in the heart of another formidable power, the Ottoman Empire. Here, the ruler isn't just a king. He's the Sultan, and after 1517, he also claimed the title of Caliph, the spiritual leader of the entire Sunni Muslim world. This dual role gave the Ottoman monarch a unique claim to both temporal and religious authority, an idea that had been bubbling in various forms since the earliest priest kings, but never quite consolidated on such a grand scale. You walk through the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a sprawling complex that isn't just a residence but a city within a city. A labyrinth of courtyards, treasuries, and harems where hundreds of women and eunuchs lived, all orbiting the central sun of the Sultan. The air here is different, perhaps cooler, with the scent of the Bosphorus Strait. You observe the intricate dance of power. The Sultan, initially a warrior chieftain, evolved into an absolute monarch whose decrees were law. His power was reinforced by institutions like the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps recruited from Christian boys, rigorously trained and fiercely loyal to the Sultan himself, not to any noble family. It was an ingenious, if somewhat brutal, system for creating a standing army devoid of feudal allegiances. You might even see a janissary, with his distinctive white felt cap, patrolling the palace grounds, looking like he's just stepped out of a highly disciplined, very serious boy band. The Ottoman Sultan's concept of legitimacy was a complex tapestry of Islamic law, dynastic right, and military prowess. Unlike some European monarchies where succession could be messy, the Ottomans had a brutal, but often effective, system. Fratricide. The ascending sultan would often order the execution of his brothers to prevent future challenges to his rule. Talk about a family reunion that goes south quickly. This practice, while horrific, ensured a strong, unchallenged succession, though it meant family dinners were probably awkward, to say the least. You see the intricate tilework, the soaring domes of mosques funded by imperial wealth, and the constant flow of goods and people through the empire's vast trading networks. The Sultan, sitting in his audience chamber, receives ambassadors from distant lands, his gaze unwavering, his authority absolute. The sheer geographical spread of the Ottoman Empire, stretching from the Balkans to North Africa and the Middle East, meant that the Sultan's reach was immense, his word carrying weight across diverse cultures and peoples. The idea of the King of Kings you encountered in Persia found a different, yet equally potent expression here, with the Sultan's title of Padishah signifying his supreme status. You open your eyes, and the dim light of your room slowly pulls you from the last vestiges of sleep. You reach for your phone, and as your thumb scrolls, an image flashes across the screen. A familiar figure, a monarch, waving from a balcony, surrounded by cheering crowds. It's an almost anachronistic sight in our hyper-modern world, isn't it? After all this time spent trudging through sun-baked Sumerian ziggurats, navigating the labyrinthine courts of pharaohs who literally believed themselves gods, or bowing before emperors whose mandate came directly from the heavens, you find yourself here. Yet somehow the idea of a king, a queen, still lingers, not just in fairy tales, but in the very real, often very grand, institutions that dot our contemporary map. You see them, the remnants of those ancient lineages, now navigating a landscape utterly alien to their powerful forebears. No longer do they command armies, declare wars unilaterally, or sentence subjects to crocodile dung sunscreen applications. Remember that charming tidbit. Instead, you watch them cut ribbons, unveil plaques, and deliver carefully worded speeches. Their thrones are often less about absolute power and more about plush velvet and historical continuity. It's a bit like watching a majestic lion who's decided that, instead of hunting wildebeest, he'll just nap elegantly on a very expensive rug and occasionally pose for photos. Adorable, really. The transition from the all-encompassing imperial dynasties of Asia and the Americas, which we just explored, to this constitutional reality was, to put it mildly, less a gentle glide and more a series of dramatic, often bloody bumps in the road. Revolutions, both violent and remarkably polite, chipped away at the divine right of kings, replacing it with parliamentary supremacy and the will of the people. This is our mainstream historical fact for today. A significant number of modern monarchies, particularly in Europe, transitioned into constitutional roles, where the monarch serves largely as a ceremonial head of state, with real political power residing in elected governments. Think of it as a demotion, but with much better hats. Yet, despite this dramatic shift, the enduring mystique of royalty, that peculiar fascination with crowns and castles and endless family drama, hasn't quite faded. You might wonder why. Is it the human need for tradition, for a tangible link to a storied past? Or perhaps it's just the ultimate reality TV show played out on a global stage with unlimited budgets for costumes. Honestly, you probably won't survive the sheer boredom of attending all those state dinners, let alone the pressure of constantly having your outfit scrutinized. It's not all tiaras and waving, you know. Consider, for a moment, one of the quirkier aspects of modern royalty. In the United Kingdom, for instance, the reigning monarch still technically owns all unmarked swans in open waters across England and Wales. Yes, swans. Imagine the royal swan counting division, diligently noting every feathery friend. It's a whimsical nod to an era when royal prerogatives extended to every creature great and small, though one suspects the monarch doesn't actually spend their weekends herding waterfowl. It's these little anachronisms that add to the charm, and occasionally the absurdity. Historians still argue whether the enduring popularity of certain monarchies is a testament to a deep-seated cultural reverence for tradition, or merely a cleverly maintained tourist attraction. There's a thriving industry around royal visits, souvenirs, and even tabloid speculation, all contributing significantly to national economies. It's almost as if centuries of absolute power have been distilled into a sophisticated form of national branding. From the glittering jewels of European houses to the unique cultural significance of monarchies in places like Japan or Thailand, these institutions continue to play a role, albeit a profoundly altered one. They are symbols, unifiers, and often the quiet guardians of national identity, providing a sense of continuity in a world that seems to change at warp speed. They are the living echoes of all those ancient rulers we've met, from the warrior kings leading their tribes to the god kings ruling vast empires, now existing in a state of dignified, ceremonial semi-retirement. And as you settle deeper into your bed, the stories of kings and queens, emperors and pharaohs begin to gently recede. The echoes of their power, their triumphs, and their downfalls soften into a murmur, like waves drawing back from the shore. You've journeyed through millennia, from the very first stirrings of leadership among our ancestors, through the rise of priest-kings, the grand spectacles of divine pharaohs, the intellectual debates of Greek city-states, the tumultuous birth and rebirth of Roman rule, and the vast, intricate tapestries of Asian and African empires. You've seen how the idea of a king transformed, adapting to new lands, new beliefs, new challenges, from a necessary protector to a divine intermediary, from a conquering warlord to a constitutional symbol. Now all those images, all those voices, become softer, less distinct. The weight of crowns and the clamor of ancient courts are fading, replaced by the gentle rhythm of your own breath. Let the stories drift like mist, like dreams not quite remembered upon waking. Feel the calm seep into your limbs, releasing any lingering thoughts of mandates of heaven or barbarian invasions. The journey is complete, the tale is told, and the long, winding path of human history, with all its leaders and all its followers, has brought us to this quiet, peaceful moment. There's nothing left to do now but close your eyes and let the silence envelop you, a soft blanket woven from forgotten eras and whispered legends. Allow yourself to float effortlessly into the deep, restorative darkness, knowing that the kings and queens, in all their forms, have finished their watch for tonight. Just peaceful, empty space until morning. Sweet dreams.